I got to tell you, true confessions here, I love State of the Union night. For politics fans, this is like Christmas morning on a January night. It's the constitutionally mandated State of the Union. Yes. As our president lays out his version of how we're doing and what we ought to be doing better. It's very exciting. It's exciting every year, even when news isn't made. This year, both the speech made some news and the theater around the speech made a tiny little bit of news. One moment of pure political theater tonight was a quasi-reprise of Congressman Joe Wilson's "You lie" moment from last year's speech on health reform. As President Obama was describing last week's Supreme Court ruling, allowing corporations the world over to spend without limit on American politicians and political campaigns, incredibly, a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Samuel Alito, shook his head and said, "Not true," or possibly simply not true. A Supreme Court spokeswoman told NBC's Pete Williams tonight, just moments ago, that Justice Samuel Alito was himself unavailable for comment on the heckling. Pete notes that Supreme Court justices who attend the State of the Union traditionally never applaud or signal approval or disapproval for a president's statements during the speech. It was for that reason that when William Rehnquist was Chief Justice, he actually discouraged members of the court from even going to the speech. He said at one point, "We look like bumps on a log." That apparently is no longer true. Now Supreme Court justices look like Republican members of Congress muttering at the president. President Obama's actual address tonight was rhetorically feisty, ending with a powerful "We don't quit, I don't quit." At the same time, a lot of his specific proposals were dealing from the politically conservative side of the deck.
Tough decisions about opening new offshore areas for oil and gas development, continued investment in advanced biofuels and clean coal technologies, restore the pay-as-you-go law for a bipartisan fiscal commission, proposing a new small business tax credit, eliminate all capital gains taxes on small business investment. We cut taxes, we cut taxes, we cut taxes, we cut taxes, we cut taxes. Now let me repeat, we cut taxes.
Cutting the capital gains tax, drill baby drill, clean coal, a Republican and Democratic deficit club, tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, get your tax cuts here. Those are not progressive caucus talking points. Still, though, the president's supporters will likely be happy to have seen him box Republicans into not standing and applauding for populist stuff like getting the banks to pay back the bailout money. And those frustrated with Republicans on health reform will doubtless enjoy a little slow-mo footage of one desperate Republican congressman, we think it's Patrick McHenry, flailing his arms and reminding his GOP colleagues that they're supposed to stand up, pretend that they like the general idea of health reform. Joining us now is White House Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett. Ms. Jarrett, thanks very much for taking time to talk with us. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Rachel. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. Thank you. I love State of the Union night. Let me get very specific right off the bat. On health care, when the president tonight welcomed anyone from either party, bringing him what he's described as new approaches for reaching the goals of health reform, was he saying that he wants to start over? Was he reopening the can of worms?
No, not at all. Start over. Look, we've made an enormous amount of progress. What he did was remind the American people and Congress why he fought so hard for health care. And he talked about the people who have pre-existing conditions that should be covered. He talked about the costs and the premiums that are and the out-of-pocket expenses that are going out of kilter and are breaking the backs of hardworking American families who are trying to make ends meet, and small businesses who are having to pick between hiring new employees and paying the cost of health care. He talked about how we really do need insurance reforms, and so we have insurance companies that are working for the American people again. And he talked about how we need to make sure that all Americans are insured and that we can provide affordable health coverage to those folks as well. And so what he really wanted to do was to remind everybody about what we were fighting so hard for. And what he said is, look, if you have a way of achieving all those objectives and bringing down our deficit, then we welcome those ideas. But I also think it reflected the spirit of how far we have come and how much progress we have made. And Rachel, what he said is, I'm not going to give up on this. The American people deserve a health insurance program that really works for them.
welcoming new ideas at this point in the process, though, does raise the prospect of where he's coming down on the different strategic sides of the debate about whether or not the House should pass the Senate bill, pass whatever changes they need to pass to the Senate bill in order for them to feel comfortable with it and move on, or whether or not it is time to reopen the policy of health reform, start bringing forward new legislation to be passed for the first time. Just to be clear, you're not saying that he's suggesting that we start new health reform legislation.
No. Look, we've come so far. We're so close, Rachel. We're right on the brink. But I think it's also recognizing that the political landscape has changed as a result of the Massachusetts election. But on the other hand, Massachusetts has health insurance. Scott Brown voted for that health insurance when he was there. He's even said he wouldn't vote to repeal it now. And so with him coming to Washington and working with the spirit of cooperation, maybe we can take this over the finish line. We're on the 2-yard line, and the president said, let's not give up now. Let's fight on behalf of this issue for the American people, because in these economic times, most importantly, we have got to figure out how to help reduce some of those costs that are on the American family. They're sitting around the kitchen table, Rachel. You know this. They're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. Their health care costs adds to that burden. It adds to the burden of the small businesses. It adds to the burden of the large businesses, and it certainly adds to the burden of our federal government. So let's not give up now. That was his message this evening.
On the subject of the political climate, which you referenced there, the list of specific proposals the president made tonight, a lot of them very conservative ideas, ideas that have been that have been sort of auditioned politically in recent years by Republican politicians. Things like offshore drilling, capital gains cuts, business tax cuts, the spending freeze, so-called clean coal, which is terminology that just makes me cringe, singling out earmarks as if earmarks really have a significant impact on our overall fiscal health. The number of things like that, there seem like conservative ideas to me, made me feel like I have to ask you if the president is just sort of fed up with the Democratic base and is more interested in winning over conservatives now.
No, of course not. I think what the president was focusing on is, in this very tough economic time, the federal government needs to tighten its belt, just like hardworking families are having to do. Every day, people are going to have to make tough decisions about how to make ends meet. And what he's saying is that we have to rebuild the public trust in the federal government. And one way of doing that is living within our means. It doesn't mean that we don't invest in what's important. Jobs and the economy were a huge part of his message this evening, and he was a strong advocate for investing in infrastructure and small businesses and green jobs, the jobs of the future. We have to do what government can do to jumpstart our economy. But he also said very clearly, Rachel, that the private sector is where the long-term sustainable jobs come from, and we have to be cognizant of that. So I think his message was one that will resonate broadly with the American people, and it's one that requires a different tone. It requires the Republicans to come to the table in good faith and not just obstruct legislation because they want to obstruct legislation. I mean, we've had instances where they've actually sponsored legislation and then voted against it, voted for it, but voted to delay it. So ultimately they voted for it, 90-10. And so he's saying, come on, everybody. The stakes are too high for the business as usual in Washington. He was elected on a momentum of change. He intends to bring that change. You mentioned earmarks. The public has a right to know how earmarks are being spent. He thinks that we should be transparent. He thinks that we need to add a level of cognizance of how taxpayer dollars are being used so that there's some accountability and that we can begin to rebuild the trust that has been suffering over the course, really, of the last decade.
I think you know, I know we don't have a lot of time. I think you know that I've expressed, or you may know that I've expressed a real disagreement with the idea that government needs to tighten its belt because the American people are tightening their belt. I think that does poll well. I think it's actually factually, macroeconomically incorrect. I think when consumers aren't spending, when businesses aren't spending, we're in this kind of a downturn, there actually does need to be a political argument that the government does need to spend. The spending freeze that the president has proposed is teaching the country bad macroeconomics, ceding to Republicans their false claim about how macroeconomic works. I think maybe losing the long-term argument about the role of government in favor of some short-term, well-polling phrase that I don't think actually makes very much factual sense.
Well, you know, Rachel, I love you, but let me just take you back a bit, just to refresh your memory. President Obama passed the largest stimulus bill in our nation's history, nearly $800 billion, shortly after he was elected president, for just the reason that you mentioned, because he knew it was important for the federal government to jumpstart the economy. In his current budget that he'll unveil next week, he will have in there very concrete spending proposals that, again, strategically will help jumpstart our economy, whether it's for infrastructure or small businesses or green jobs of the future. He does believe that government needs to spend, but it needs to be strategic, and there needs to be a discipline, and there needs to be accountability. And we also need to tighten our belts, and we need to get rid of programs that are not working. We cannot be afraid to say, okay, you know what, we tried this and it was a good idea, but it didn't work, and take those resources, Rachel, and put them into programs that will work. And we do have to be sensitive to the deficit, and I think for just the macroeconomic reasons that you set forth a minute ago, that's why he pushed for the stimulus bill, and that's why he's not saying dramatically tighten our belts right now. He is saying let's be prudent and let's be cognizant of the fact that these are taxpayer dollars, and we need to spend them strategically and sensibly. So